Thank you for joining us on the podcast. We're recording this really close to 2:30, which, as everybody knows, is the best time to go to the dentist. So I'm joined. That didn't go anywhere. Didn't even get a smile out of Josh. I just sort of the joke is my go-to 2:30 joke. And then so I'm here with Josh Fisher, who's another trainer here at High Five, and we're going to be talking about attribution theory. And why we're bringing this up is because every single week we try to do this as a training team. We do a tiny Teach Tuesday, which is like we're going to offer a little piece of information that maybe we know. We're going to teach the group something that we're excited about, interested in. And Josh brought attribution theory to the group. And as he was speaking and I was ignoring him, I was typing podcast episode. That's often where my brain goes, but I was definitely listening. And so I'm going to give you a quick synopsis what I did when I Googled attribution theory, and then Josh will fill in the gaps. Attribution theory is a social psychology theory that explains how people interpret the causes and events and behaviors. It helps explain why people act the way they do and how they form attitudes and make decisions. An incredibly important informational theory for folks who are working in adventure education. So Josh, hand it over to you. What do you want to share about attribution theory?
Yeah, so I first came across attribution theory in college, in one of my capstone theory courses. And I just thought it was really interesting and illuminating in some ways about my own behaviors and choices that I've made in the past, mostly revolving around when I have wrongly attributed my successes or failures. It was just really interesting to be given this structure to reflect on those things that I had done in the past. And I try and apply it to my training, educating, and everyday life too. So yeah, that definition that you gave, Phil, is pretty spot on. It's not a super complicated theory. It mostly is just, like you said, Phil, like we go through an event, we then perceive whether or not that was a success or a failure, and then we attribute reasons as to why we succeeded or failed. So nothing too nebulous here that we're trying to grasp. And there's 3 factors that have been put forth that influence how we attribute things. The first is our locus. And so that's kind of like figuratively the location of the source of that success or failure. And they break it into 2 groups, internal and external. So things that we can control and things we can't control, or inside or outside of us rather. And stability being the second. So thinking about change over time when it comes to stability. So are these things more fixed, or can we change them in the moment? Or are we going to need to develop ways to work at them over a longer period of time? Then the last factor is controllability. So how, to the extent of like how much an individual can affect that factor. And those are broken down into controllable and uncontrollable. And as educators, theories ideally have our participants kind of engaging in the internal, unstable, controllable, because it's something that is happening to them or by them, and it is not super stable over a course of time. So then they can work at these things and change the effect.
So if it you determined like success and failure, where do you see participants? What do you see as like a common area that you think maybe people make a misstep when they're attributing their success or their failure? Is it like they're just applying it to luck? Or are they saying that it's like all them, but it's actually not? Where do you see most of the attribution going?
So part of this is, they call it I think they call it the fundamental attribution error, which is basically we typically assume when we observe others that their successes are based on things, their internal bits, right? Things that they control. And when we reflect on our own experiences, we often immediately go to those external factors because it's easier for whatever reason to engage with. And we kind of always assume, most people always assume that other people's success means, wow, they really worked hard at it. And you might just be like, well, even though you may have worked hard at it for whatever reason, whether it's a social implication or otherwise, you are just like, oh, I was lucky. So I see, I guess to answer your question, I see most participants attributing their successes or failures due to the task difficulty. That's a big one, which is uncontrollable, right? You know, if we set out to climb to do the Prusik climb on the course and we only make it halfway up the rope, but our goal was to get to the top, they might just be like, that thing was really hard, which the Prusik climb is super hard. But I know last spring when we were opening the course, you and I got to spend some time on the slippery incline log. And even though the incline log is viewed as this like relatively easy element compared to some others, it was really hard that day. And so we had to change like that attribution, like, okay, we didn't fail at climbing the incline log today because that's inherently a difficult task. There was an uncontrollable factor in the environment of it being just after winter and slippery that led to our failure, if you will.
How do you introduce or interact with this attribution theory with participants? Do you frame it like early on and then just make people aware, or is it when they then start saying like, I can't do this because whatever, and they're like attributing maybe inaccurately to something they're out of control, or I'm trying to think like where I could see it, because I certainly I can reflect on many experiences exactly as you're suggesting. Like if they do well, it's like, oh, I was just lucky. And then just like if they do badly, it's like everything, I'm terrible. It's like, how do you introduce it to groups?
I think for me, I don't necessarily introduce the theory to groups. I'm using it as a tool in my observation. So as the leader of the group or instructor or educator, there is a role that you play in this as well. So like I think about task setting, and in our world, we talk a lot about scaffolding skills and having a really nice progression of games and activities to low elements so that they're never faced with this outlandish task that they have no preparation for. And then it's about like another big topic that we're engaging with at High Five is like rephrasing things intentionally for specific outcomes. So like if someone succeeds at something, being like, good work, like you're so smart or you're such an amazing climber, even though that might be true, might not be the best way to like keep them engaged with that, how they're attributing that success or failure, right? So like I think of like a way that you could reframe it is like, wow, you nailed that. Like you put a lot of effort into that. I could really see, like really making it about something that they can control, like effort, for instance, because that can change. It's very unstable. That can change over the course of a day, right? So like, making sure that they're realizing that, hey, yes, you have a lot of inherent talent or skill or physical capabilities, but at the end of the day, you tried really hard and that's what led to your success.
I was just on Wednesday skiing and I was really interacting with this in skiing. My daughter is, what was going to say, like, she's very physically able in terms of like, she's very strong, flexible, all these things. So she picks up stuff quite quick. And another parent was talking about his son, and he was attributing him not being as successful down to him not trying. And I know, and it was very interesting, like the parent attributing the kid's success to something that he's not entirely sure of, but with like solidity, like clarity of like, he just never tries. And it's like, well, he's here. So, there's clearly some trying that was happening, because if this kid isn't being as successful and yet he's still there, that almost indicates there's trying. It's like, it's almost the opposite. I would say like my daughter's not trying because she's like making it easy, right? Like,
yeah,
where's the stretch for her? And I think like this is as good information as well, because I like your free frame. It's not necessarily for the students, almost for you in terms of the way that we practice our language. Because I think that what we're doing as educators, we're attributing people's success and failures to either of these things. That's probably inaccurate also, because we're only doing it based on our point of view. So it's very challenging. So anyway, sort of like that just kind of opened up my mind to like, oh yeah, I've seen this in other places. And how do we kind of reframe that in for ourselves and maybe for others around us? Because maybe people listening, they're seeing this from like peers giving feedback or teachers pushing or giving feedback. How might you reframe this other than just saying the reframe for your stuff? But like if you observed other people saying this, how could you maybe reframe it?
Oh man. Well, I think first and foremost is ask questions, right? Like that's typically how I would approach this rather than me, pushing my observation and assumptions onto their experience, like just helping them through that framework, that process of reflecting on what just happened to hopefully get them to that point of finding that thing that then they can create a strategy to address, right? Because if we can't ever get it to that internal bit where it's like something that you can control and something that you can change, then like, I don't know, might be barking up the wrong tree. But I thought it was interesting in your story, you brought up like Ella's ability and like how do we find that next challenge for her? And so I think part, and this was a tough thing when I was first introduced to this theory for me to understand, is that ability is a pretty stable thing. If we think about like your climbing ability, you might have had that like quick ascent when you were first just learning. So you acquired a bunch of new skills really quick. And then over the course of time, they've kind of moved into that mastery realm. And so now you have this ability to climb, right? You can do the thing, but often once we get to that point of like competency, that next step to mastery can take some time, which is good, right? And like that's why mastery of skills is so difficult. And where I was going with this is that like finding that next thing for Ella is asking those questions about like, how did those things feel for her? Like when you were initiating your turn, were you feeling pressure in your toes? Were you feeling it here and there? And getting them to engage on that next level of that activity that they're doing so that they can continue to improve.
Yeah, there's something I was trying to get her to say this, but like it's hard for me even to do it. But like when she was saying, because I was asking her how things was, and she was like, she did a woods trail for the first time, so she was getting in around trees, and I asked her how it was, and she said, "Oh, it was super easy." And then I was like, "Well, just it, maybe it's super easy for you." I was right behind her, and so I asked her first, and then the reality is, it was hard. Maybe it was because I was taller, but my quads were hurting, everything was hurting, and so she says this easy. I'm like, well, maybe say easy for you, because. But then what's intriguing is you're bringing this up, and I'm thinking about like anytime I've brought groups to the course, sometimes and I've told this to other educators, those kids, those participants, those teachers that we train, those that struggle, we almost prefer them because their outcome from the struggle seems to be greater. But what we're sort of doing in that process is diminishing and ignoring those people who found it easier for themselves, and then not considering like, how do I make a stretch for them though? Maybe we just don't have enough time. But if you had a program where you had participants who are really good at climbing, everything we kind of gave them as a challenge was not a challenge. What would you consider maybe, how do you make that next challenge for them? Is it maybe just giving them roles like, oh, I'm going to teach you how to belay next? Or like, what's that? How do we make something more challenging? Because I've heard people use the blindfold. It's like, oh, I'm going to give them a blindfold. And spoiler alert on that one, I actually think that makes it easier. I found like people who struggle to climb, give them a blindfold because they don't see what's coming. Like if a kid is able to walk across, close their eyes, it doesn't really change too much of a challenge. But what would be that kind of, how do you make things harder?
Man, that's a great question. And something I'm sure that all educators kind of struggle with at times. I don't know. I know that for me personally, when I get that added challenge of, okay, now teach the thing to someone else, that's kind of that next layer of engagement, right? Because they know the what, They might know the why and the where, but they're really engaging with that how, I think, right? It was like, and let them, and I think part of that is like putting them in a different role, right? Like oftentimes we have our belayers, be the one communicating with the climber. And so allowing them to be in that position and take on that larger role, I think is good. I find it interesting you talk about blindfolding, sensory deprivation, if you will. Because in my kayaking experience, one of my mentors often says to me, when I get a skill down, like we'll just say like crossing eddy lines, so conflicting bits of water in the river, and it can be unstable at times and tip you over if you don't control the variables. But then once I was like nailing that down, he was just like, all right, now I want you to do it, and I want you to close your eyes and really feel what's happening, to create that synaptic connection between that physical bit and that mental piece, I think, with the aim of getting to that flow state, right? Where like in flow state, you are one with what's happening around you. You're not really like analyzing and applying solutions. You're just doing and feeling. And so I think in some applications that sensory deprivation is great. But yeah, I tend to agree with you that on the challenge course, it kind of, I use it more as a tool, like you said, to manage folks' anxiety around fear or anxiety around climbing, more so than adding challenge.
One other thing I wanted to touch on with attribution, because I know that we talked about this when we were doing our Tiny Teach, and you'd written a note about it, is this idea of pre-attribution. So this is the part that like I think is challenging, and this is where it's like we deal with different people coming into a space. That I think the suggestion of pre-attribution was based on stuff that's happened to you in the past, previous events. We might find that different attribution is dependent on different events, and like how do we maybe interact with that in our roles as adventure educators? I think I'm unsure of like what I would do in a scenario if based on previous events on a situation, how I might be able to reframe their attribution.
Yeah. Or are you confirming their attribution?
That's true.
So recently, Lisa Hunt and I were working on a training proposal and some new elements for one of our clients, and they were talking about their use of their, for all intents and purposes, pamper pole. And they had some concerns around the belay and its safety and the usefulness in their programming. They were pretty much set on moving on from this element because the belay mostly just sketched them out. They had participants kind of swinging back into, it's an indoor course, so swinging back into the wall, or perceivably swinging back into the wall. And one of the thoughts that I had actually was about this, like why are they so fearful and anxious of this element? Part of it could be design. I don't think it is. I think that our builders do a great job in managing all those things. So I'm assuming that they're attributing their anxiety or fear or or whatever to the pamper pole, to their misoperation in some way, or just like maybe just like that gap in knowledge or gap in performance, and with some questioning around what made them anxious and fearful and seeing how they do it. I think that we could possibly facilitate an experience where they would feel more comfortable doing the pamper pull, because then hopefully they will reflect back on those previous attributions and attribute their new successes to this like increase in knowledge or skill or these things that they can control. But yeah, you're totally right that it creates this unwillingness to participate, right? As shown in this story, where they're like, no, we don't even want to consider training on it, because we just want to move on. So they're just unwilling to participate. And I think that's really where, like, that's the big thing that I focus on as an educator, is like the impact that I'm having on my students or the folks in my group, and like really making sure that they are attributing those successes or failures to those things that they can control and to what actually happened. Because if we don't, right, it leads to that that like feeling of learned helplessness, that like I've had so many experiences doing this one thing, it's always gone wrong, so I'm just not going to do that anymore. But it could just be this simple little thing like, oh, just move the belay hardware 2 feet this way and it's going to change your outcome.
It's funny how like as you're saying stuff, I'm just going back to like experiences that I've had where I've heard some of this, and this is another Ella story, but I'm immersed in a 9-year-old child's upbringing in the moment, and we were playing Mario Party, so on the Switch, and there were a lot of mini games in there, and we
Yeah.
played a mini game, and a mini game came up that she has lost a lot at, and she just like put the controller down and it's like, I'm not doing this. I can't ever do this.
Mm.
And it was like very like the fixed mindset model, but it had come from like so many times of trying and then being like, all right, I'm done. And I think that we see that a lot with our clients that come in who are like, I tell you what, one of the things I see a lot is like a knot. If you, there was a teacher I was working with who before I walked into the, like finished walking into the room, she came right up to me and was like, just so you know, I've tried to do the knot that you're going to teach in this. I can't do it. So don't even bother teaching it to me. I was like, wow. I was like, okay, well, give me a little bit of benefit of the doubt that maybe I have a different way to teach it. So I will try. And I think that sometimes that learned helplessness is, it doesn't just happen with students like kids, it happens with like adults who are, I would say even more so maybe because you've had more opportunities to practice and you've got a less bandwidth for like, now the clock is ticking. I don't have time to learn something new. But I go back to what you said as though like there's a little bit of that ownership. I think that, and I've mentioned this before, we have so much responsibility as outdoor educators or adventure educators. I think sometimes we forget that, both in the positive and the negative. And a lot of times, like your story of the Pamper Pole, how many times is like maybe someone has taught them incorrectly, or maybe they haven't had the time to practice, then that has created this continuous wheel of negativity. And we have this chance, especially if a group has come to your course and they've never seen it before. Every single group, doesn't matter your attitude, your affect, things that have happened to you in the day, as much as there might be, you can own those things. But no, we have like a very important window of positive introduction to the industry. I think it's why like team building gets sometimes this bad rap, like kumbaya circles, like that kind of stuff. It's just because it happens so often and we've just created this bandwidth of negative experience. So we have to work hard to actually flip it and attribute this experience to having some positive leaning rather than negative leaning.
Right. Yeah, no, and man, I resonate with that story about Ella and Mario Party so much. I am familiar with that game. And I happen to know that there are some mini games that are very much just luck. Like
Yes.
it has
Hiding behind the object, there's a curtain, and you have to hide behind a rock or a mushroom house.
yeah,
That's the worst.
yeah,
Why are we even playing this? Especially when you play against the computer.
right. And that's one of those circumstances where it's like, man, like you really want to nail in like that was luck, Ella. Like you didn't lose this mini game. You haven't lost this mini game X amount of times in a row because you're bad at it. It's because you have no control over this situation. And sometimes that's just how it is. Right. And like sometimes you're lucky and sometimes you're not. And I think that's okay. Right. Like that's the hard part about attribution is like life happens. And like beyond the now, we also have all of these lived experiences that shape how we see the new ones, right? So it can be a challenging ridge to walk on.
Awesome. So I'm going to say that I hope that the aim of a lot of these topics, whenever we bring up a topic, is just to get people thinking. And I want to own something that, because people will often say like, wow, I should have known about this or known about a theory. When Josh brought this, it was the first time I'd heard of it. And so, and I've been doing this a long time. It's a little bit like I do not have the academic background in adventure education or outdoor education. So there's a lot of things I haven't heard. And so it was a good note of like, don't assume that people don't know about a thing, or don't get embarrassed if you don't know about a thing. It's like we are continuously growing as educators. So, and it just is another lens for me to just consider. And I think the really important thing is the language I use, the celebration of people's achievement, and how am I attributing some of that success, and trying not to lean it more towards like, you just are naturally gifted at this, or you're just very unlucky. Like I try to figure out like how do we make it so that they have control over this, and so they can attribute some of that to their own abilities or their own effort rather than things that are unstable and uncontrollable. Josh, any final thoughts on this before we wrap?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think for the most part, I think it's all about just like living in reality, I guess, like the now and the future, and really trying to see why things are happening rather than assume. But yeah, I do think that, just quickly on something you said about like one experience that I have is I got to go climbing with a IFMGA mountain guide. He works all over the world, and we were climbing here in Vermont, and I was climbing. I'm not the biggest climber. I can do it, but I'm certainly not a professional. And I was climbing some routes that were, quote, above my pay grade. And he was attributing my success to the fact that I have very long arms and a very long body, which I totally agreed with him in that moment, And I think like for him, like helping me attribute my success to that, like myself, was going to help keep me out of dangerous situations in the future. Where like, cause then if I say like, man, I climbed 511 routes with Kel, and then I go and I try and take that skill on my own with some friends, and I try and go climb some crazy routes, I might not be as successful, and I might put myself in situations where I'm going to be working backwards or get hurt or whatever. So I think it's like focus on the good when it's good, and focus on the bad when it's bad. And like, I think like try and create that culture in your groups as an educator that, like, we talk a lot about this, Phil, that failure is okay. And that failure is a part of learning. And that, as I think that's the biggest hurdle for most folks to get over, right? Is like that performance anxiety, or if they're in front of a group, or personal goals or whatever it is. And it's like, it's got to be okay to fail, because that's how we're going to learn. That's how we're going to be able to have moments to reflect back and develop strategies to move forward.
Awesome. So I'm going to add into the description some information. So if you want to read more about attribution theory, you can. And I'm also going to stick Josh's email in as another resource to reach out if you have questions and you want to learn more. Then that's how you can do so. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Josh, for joining us. And I'll see you on the next one.